And now with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our first storyteller, Megan McMahon. Megan and her friends always knew that you're not supposed to go hitchhiking in a place that you're not really familiar with, but they decided to do it anyway. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Here she is to tell you her story, The Hitchhikers.
I was sitting in the middle back bench of the van. It was a van with wood paneling on the exterior, one of those 60s, 70s era vans with no windows in the back, your classic kidnapper van. Now, to be clear, I have never been kidnapped, but the situation wasn't good, and it was deteriorating rapidly. As I sat there observing everything around me, I was very aware of the door to my right. All I had to do was yank it open, dive, and roll out. And as I sat there contemplating my escape, the man in the front seat turned around. And with his big, droopy mustache and dark, beady eyes, he said, "You know, I could kill you." Now, I made some bad decisions in my life, but choosing to work at Yellowstone National Park the summer after my freshman year of college was not one of them. It was a glorious summer. I worked with young people from all over the US and all over the world. Besides learning to fold napkins and carry heavy trays of dirty dishes through the Old Faithful Inn restaurant, I learned how to make jungle juice with Mike from Minnesota. I went mountain biking under the full moon with Brandon from Ohio. Polly from Alabama, she taught me how to smoke cigarettes in front of Old Faithful Geyser. And the twins from Georgia showed me how to drink 7-7s. And Tyrone from Mississippi, he taught me, girl, don't bruise these peaches. I had hit the jackpot of fun. In fact, I was thinking I might never go back to college. I might hit the ski resort circuit with Jamie from Vermont. Who knew? We were all young, and we were all a little reckless. So, on our days off, we spent a lot of time camping and backpacking. My shift ended on a Friday in the morning, and I didn't have to work again until Monday evening. 3 full days of freedom, plenty of time to get into trouble, and I took full advantage. 4 of us were planning an epic backpacking journey: Christy, Brandon, Mike, and myself. We were going to do 36 miles in 2.5 days to some of the most remote part of Yellowstone Park. The caveat was, it was one direction, and we had to get out of Old Faithful, over to West Yellowstone, travel south out of Montana into northern Idaho, and come back in through the southern entrance of the park. And for people with no cars, getting this 100 miles to the trailhead would require some hitchhiking, a little luck, and the goodwill of strangers. That weekend started like any other, getting our food all ready for the trail, and making sure we had a bear bag. Yellowstone is bear country. And although there's no longer any grizzlies, there's plenty of black and brown bears, and we were going to be way out in the backcountry. We took so long getting organized that we did not get out on the road till close to 3 p.m. Our first ride was in the back of a covered pickup truck, got us into West Yellowstone. Then we pulled out our sign that said park employees to work some hitchhiking magic. And finally, we were picked up by a retired couple that took us out of Montana and into the northern Idaho town of Ashton. What's in Ashton, you ask? Not a whole lot. A bar, a store, and rednecks. We had about 15 miles to get to the park entrance. It was close to 5:30, still plenty of hours left to find a ride and to start our hike. We walked to the edge of town, which took us about a minute, put our backpacks down, and sat by the side of the road and waited. And we waited, and we waited, and we waited. Finally, a car on the horizon, and it was a truck. We leaped up and stuck our thumbs out, and the music was blaring as the truck approached us. And as it roared by full speed, some kid yelled, "You'll never get a ride in this town!" And they laughed and giggled, and we heard him zoom away. We decided to change our tactics. We went with the female cart. Christy and I split up from the boys and walked about 100 yards up the road, and as luck would have it, there on the horizon, down the road, came a van. An old van with wood paneling on the sides, no windows in the back, your classic kidnapper van. Now, I've made some good decisions in my life, but this is not one of my finer decision-making moments. And as that van pulled up and the tinted windows rolled down, Christy and I gave our biggest smiles. And a man with long, greasy hair, big, droopy mustache, and a beat-up trucker cap. This was way before trucker caps were cool. He peered at us out the window. He had this kind of crazy Vietnam vet thing going. He was creepy. And we were desperate. And desperation doesn't lead to good choices. Turns out there was 3 of them in the truck, 2 brothers and a cousin. And yes, they reluctantly had room for all 4 of us. So we slid that van door open and we climbed in. As I said, not one of my wiser decision-making moments. Lucky Christy, because she was tiny, she got to sit in the middle seat in the front, in between the brothers. I sat on the middle bench next to the cooler, Mike sat on the floor next to me, and Brandon sat in the back next to the cousin and a huge jar of pickled eggs. Being full-on, long-haired, brain-addled, beer-bellied rednecks, first thing they did was pull out a couple 6-packs of Bud Light. Started passing those around, and they got to asking us, what were we doing way out in that part of northern Idaho, barely in Yellowstone Park? We told them about the 36 miles back to Old Faithful. You guys ready for the bears? We had a bear bag. They laughed. Don't wear cherry chapstick in bear country, like you wake up with a bear licking your lips. We laughed again. If a bear chases you, run uphill. Bears can't run fast uphill. We laughed again, but this time, not as heartily. And finally, bears smell sex. They'll eat you from the crotch out. Now, the 4 of us were friends, and I hadn't been planning on hooking up this weekend, but let me tell you, the thought of a bear eating me from the crotch out pretty much killed any sex drive I may have had. It was quiet, only the sound of the engine, the pickled eggs sloshing around, and all of us thinking about bears and their peculiar habits. And it got weirder and weirder. At one point, they were lighting firecrackers inside the van and throwing them out the window. More Bud Lights, telling some dirty jokes, and the guy in the front seat kept putting his hand on Christy's thigh. And it was at that point that he turned around and looked at us in the back, and with his long, greasy hair and his beady eyes, it felt like he looked right in my soul, as he said, "You know, I could kill you." And it was silence. And I stared back at him, and I did the only thing I could think of to do. I laughed. And I laughed, and I fake laughed, hoping and praying that the more I laughed, the more this would turn into some sick joke. And all of us in the back laughed and fake laughed, hoping and praying that the park gates would show up at any moment. And as we laughed, our rednecks, they started laughing too. And we bounced along in this van, and more nervous laughter, and more dirty jokes, and more Bud Lights, and more firecrackers, and I learned how to make pickled eggs. And finally we arrived at the campsite and the ranger station. We pulled up, and the van door slid open, and we tumbled out, and smoke wafted out, and we were so relieved to be there that we hugged our rednecks goodbye. And then, for whatever reason, the ranger station was still open, and the guy gave us a permit for a campsite 5 miles in, and we started hiking, speed hiking. We were joyful. We felt invincible. And as the sun set and the full moon came out, we hiked our last couple miles to the campground, set up a tent, sat on a log eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, just delighted with life. When all of a sudden, we heard something. There was a sound, a kind of a snuffling, snorting, munching sound. And we froze and we listened. It sounded like something was just being ripped out of the earth. And my heart started pounding. What was it? It sounded huge. It sounded like something non-human coming up the creek bed right by our campsite. And we stared out into the dark. And then under the full moon, we saw it. And I checked my lips to make sure I wasn't wearing any cherry chapstick, because up there in the creek bed was a large bear We grabbed that food and shoved it in the bear bag and heaved it over the tree and dove into the tent as we could hear snuffling and snorting along the creek bed. And we sat there squeezed together, frozen side by side, praying that this was not a crotch-eating bear. And forever, it felt like forever, but finally, that bear passed and went off into the moonlight. We did make it back to Old Faithful and made it just in time for dinner shift, and I did go back to college. But I did learn a couple things from my rednecks. I know that wasn't the best decision, jumping in the back of that van, but I'll tell you what I learned. 1, if you value your crotch, no sex in the backcountry. 2, leave the cherry chapstick at home. And if you need a recipe for pickled eggs, I got one.